What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense, uncompromising actors goes head-to-head with one of the industry's most politically outspoken icons on live television? Today, we're breaking down the moment Tom Cruise completely dismantled Jane Fonda on The View in what many still call one of the most uncomfortable celebrity interviews ever aired. Before we unpack this train wreck, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story has more twists than a Mission Impossible plot. It all began innocently enough. Cruise was on the usual press tour for his latest blockbuster. The producers at The View thought having him join the panel would be light entertainment, a bit of movie talk, a few laughs, a charming soundbite or two. What they didn't plan for was Jane Fonda being in one of her most confrontational moods. From the moment Tom stepped onto the stage, the air changed. You could feel it. Whoopi Goldberg opened with easy questions about the stunts, the training, the preparation. Tom was in full Cruise mode, intense, focused, charismatic. "The thing about this character," he said, leaning forward, eyes locked on Whoopi, "is he represents something real. Someone who doesn't back down from what's right, no matter the cost." That's when Fonda pounced. She'd been sitting quietly with a faint, knowing smirk waiting. "That's interesting, Tom," she cut in, her voice smooth but sharp. "Because I have to wonder about someone who talks so much about doing what's right while being part of an organization that's not exactly known for transparency." The audience tensed. For a split second, Tom's expression faltered. The promotional smile slipped, then reappeared. But behind the grin, his eyes hardened. Whoopi tried to rescue the segment. "Let's talk about those action sequences," but Fonda wouldn't let go. "No, I think this is important," she pressed, voice rising. "Here we have someone who plays the all-American hero on screen, but in real life, he's deeply involved with a group that many former members describe as manipulative and controlling. Don't you think the public deserves some honesty about that?" The studio went silent. You could hear the creak of chairs as the hosts shifted uncomfortably. Cruise didn't flinch. Instead, he did something unexpected. He laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. "Jane," he said finally, shaking his head with something that looked almost like pity, "that might be the most hypocritical thing I've heard in years." The smile on her face vanished. "Excuse me?" She shot back. "You want to talk about questionable organizations?" Tom continued, voice low and steady. "You want to talk about pretending to stand for something? Jinyu flew to North Vietnam while American soldiers were dying. You posed for propaganda photos with the enemy. And now you want to lecture me about patriotism and honesty." The tension cracked like lightning. Fonda's face flushed crimson. "That was a different time," she stammered. "That was about ending a senseless war." "A different time," Tom echoed, his intensity rising. "Those weren't numbers, Jane. Those were sons and daughters. Real people. And while you were taking those photos, they were dying in the mud. And now you're sitting here questioning my character." Joy Behar tried to interject. "Maybe we should take a step back," but it was too late. The moment had escaped anyone's control. Fonda snapped back, voice shaking but fierce. "At least I had the courage to stand up for what I believed in. At least I wasn't hiding behind some cult-like organization that tells me what to think." That's when the temperature in the room dropped. Cruise leaned in slightly, his voice now quiet to quiet. "Cult-like organization," he repeated. "Jane, let me tell you something about courage. Courage isn't flying to enemy territory for a photo op. Courage isn't grandstanding for cameras while real heroes are dying in rice paddies. Courage is taking responsibility for your actions and living with the consequences. Something you've never quite learned to do." The air was thick. No one moved. Even the camera operators hesitated, unsure whether to keep rolling. What had started as a promotional chat had become something raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. Fonda tried to regain her footing, but the balance of power in the room had already shifted. I'm not going to sit here and be lectured by someone who, Jane began, her voice trembling with restrained fury. But Tom cut her off mid-sentence. His tone dropped an octave, quiet but commanding. No, Jane, you are going to sit there and listen. Because for once in your life, someone is going to tell you the truth without worrying about your feelings, your politics, or your reputation. The audience froze. Even the sound of studio equipment seemed to fade. Tom's composure was slipping, that famous intensity rising like steam in a pressure cooker. You want to talk about organizations, he said, his voice now hard and sharp. Let's talk about how you've spent decades preaching morality while conveniently forgetting your own history. The words hit like a punch. Fonda visibly recoiled, her posture tightening, the veneer of calm starting to fracture. But Tom wasn't finished. Not even close. You know what really gets me, Jane? He continued, leaning forward, his eyes locked on hers with surgical precision. You think that because you've said sorry once or twice in a controlled interview, the damage just disappears. You think that reinventing yourself as a feminist icon means everyone forgets that you gave aid and comfort to the very people who were torturing American soldiers. The tension was unbearable. Even Whoopi looked uneasy as she tried one more time to intervene. Tom, maybe we can pivot to your upcoming projects? He didn't even glance at her. His focus was unshakable. And the worst part, he said, his voice steady now, like a man cutting through lies one by one. You've never owned what you did. You've made excuses. You've rationalized. You've tried to rewrite the story. But you've never once looked into a camera and said, I was wrong. I hurt people. And I'm sorry. Fonda's hand trembled as she reached for her water. I have apologized, she said, her voice barely audible. I've said many times that I regret. Tom interrupted sharply. You regret it like it was a bad PR move. His tone was cold now. Jane, do you have any idea what it felt like for the families of those posed to see you laughing with their captors? Do you understand what that betrayal looked like through the eyes of people who had sons dying in that war? The camera zoomed in close enough to catch every twitch of her jaw, every flicker in his eyes. Fonda looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, while Tom seemed to draw power from the silence around them. But here's what really gets me, he said, his intensity building again. After everything you did, after all the pain you caused, you still sit here attacking my beliefs, my choices, my integrity. You talk about people being controlled. Jane, you've been controlled by your own ego for 50 years, controlled by your need to stay relevant, controlled by this idea that your voice must always be the loudest in the room, even when you've stopped saying anything meaningful. Joy Behar finally spoke up, her voice unsteady. Tom, I think you're being maybe a little harsh. Tom turned toward her slowly, his expression calm but deadly serious. Joy, let me ask you something, he said. If someone in your family had been captured in Vietnam, tortured, and then survived, how do you think they'd feel seeing Jane's little peace trip on the front page? Would you tell them they're being too harsh for feeling betrayed? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Joy started to respond, but stopped. There was no comeback that wouldn't sound hollow. Tom turned back to Fonda, his tone softening slightly, but losing none of its conviction. You know what the real tragedy is, Jane? You could have been a force for good. You had influence, a platform, the power to make real change. But instead of using it with responsibility, you turned yourself into a symbol of self-righteous activism, the kind that's more about headlines than humanity. Fonda took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. That's not fair, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. I've dedicated my life to fighting for causes, for women, for the planet, for justice. Tom gave a small, humorless laugh. Fighting for causes, he repeated. Jane, showing up at a few rallies and giving speeches isn't fighting. Fighting is what those men did while you were posing for photos with the people shooting at them. Fighting is what their families did, holding on to hope while you gave the enemy propaganda fuel. The room was still. Nobody dared move. This wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a reckoning between two visions of what conviction really means. Fonda leaned forward, her eyes glinting with what little strength she had left. "At least I've evolved," she said quietly. "At least I've learned from my mistakes. Can you say the same, Tom? Can you really look at me and say that your organization, your choices, are beyond reproach?" The studio lights buzzed faintly overhead. Tom didn't blink. The air between them was electric. Two eras, two ideologies, locked in a moment neither could back down from. "That there aren't people who've been hurt." Jane's voice wavered as she tried to redirect the focus, desperate to claw back control of the conversation. But Tom was ready, almost waiting for that line. His eyes narrowed slightly, a faint smirk forming. "You want to talk about evolution, Jane?" he said. "Let me tell you what evolution actually looks like." He leaned forward, his tone slow, deliberate, each word landing like a hammer. "Evolution is taking responsibility for your actions without making excuses. It's admitting when you're wrong without trying to justify why you are wrong. It's understanding that some things can't be undone, and living better isn't about spin, it's about humility." His voice gained momentum, rising with conviction. "But what you've done? That's not evolution. That's image rehabilitation. You've spent decades rewriting history, polishing it, shaping it, erasing the parts that make you uncomfortable. You don't want accountability, Jane. You want forgiveness without the truth." Fonda's expression faltered. For the first time, she looked shaken, her usual poise gone. "You don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "You don't know what it was like back then, the pressure, the confusion, the confusion." Tom shot back immediately. "Jane, let me clear that up for you. When your country is at war and your countrymen are dying, you don't fly to the enemy's capital and pose for propaganda photos. That's not confusion. That's a failure of basic decency." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter, but infinitely more cutting. "You know what really gets to me, Jane? It's not just what you did. It's how you've handled it ever since." His gaze was unwavering. "You've built a career out of victimhood. Poor Jane, she was young, naive, manipulated. Poor Jane, the world was too cruel to her noble ideals. You've spent half a century turning that narrative into your shield. But you weren't a victim in Vietnam. They were." He pointed subtly toward the audience as if invoking the ghosts of those affected. "The prisoners who were tortured. The families who waited years for their sons to come home. The soldiers who watched you hand propaganda victories to the people trying to kill them. They were the victims. You just made a choice and then spent the rest of your life running from it." The air was thick and still. Even the studio crew seemed frozen. Now, decades later, Tom continued, his voice climbing again. "You want to sit here and question my integrity? You've spent more time repairing your image than you ever spent facing what you did. You've turned yourself into a professional victim, and you think that gives you moral authority?" Fonda's breathing was shaky. "I was trying to end a war," she said desperately. "I was trying to bring attention to something wrong." "No," Tom said, cutting her off. His voice was low, precise, like a blade. "You were trying to get attention, period. If you really wanted to end the war, there were 1,000 ways to do it, ways that didn't involve giving comfort to the enemy. But those ways wouldn't have gotten you on every front page, would they?" The accusation hit like thunder. Fonda blinked rapidly, her composure crumbling. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Tom didn't stop. "You want to know the difference between your choices and mine?" He said, "My choices are about helping people. About trying to make things better, not worse. About adding something good to the world. Yours were about making yourself the center of a tragedy that didn't belong to you. And that's exactly what you're doing here today." Whoopi, visibly tense, tried one last time to intervene. Maybe we should all just take a breath, but Tom pressed on, his voice unwavering. You know what's really telling about all of this, Jane? You came here ready to attack me, my beliefs, my character, my integrity. You had your talking points loaded. But the second someone held you accountable, you fell apart. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. He leaned back slightly, his tone cooling, but his words hitting even harder. It's easy to throw stones when you think you're untouchable. It's easy to play the moral authority when everyone else is afraid to challenge you. But it's a lot harder to face the fact that your own house is made of glass. Fonda looked shattered. Her earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by something raw and exposed. She sat in silence, staring down at the table. Her shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of his words had settled over her. Tom watched her quietly for a moment, then spoke again, softer, but with unmistakable gravity. "And do you know what really saddens me, Jane?" he said. "You could have used this moment differently. You could have faced your past head-on, admitted the pain you caused, and shown people what real growth looks like." Cruise said, his tone now calm but cutting. "You could have used your platform to help others heal instead of trying to rewrite your own story. But instead, you came here to drag someone else down, hoping that if you threw enough mud, people might forget yours." The camera zoomed in on Fonda's face, and for the first time that afternoon, she looked utterly lost. The defiance that had once animated her was gone. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes unfocused. She looked like someone who had finally realized that the armor she'd worn for decades had just shattered under the weight of truth. That's what people like you never seem to understand. Cruise went on, his voice heavy with disappointment rather than anger. Real strength isn't about humiliation. Real courage isn't found in performance. It's found in taking responsibility, in facing what you've done and trying to make it right. You've spent years justifying, spinning, explaining. But integrity isn't about rewriting, it's about reckoning. Joy Behar finally spoke up, though her voice wavered. "Jane has done a lot of good work over the years." She offered weakly. Cruise turned toward her, the faintest trace of pity in his eyes. "Has she? Or has she just done a lot of work that looks good?" Because there's a difference between helping people and making sure the cameras are rolling while you do it. He turned back to Fonda, who sat frozen, staring down at her folded hands. "Jane," he said quietly, "when you go home tonight, when the lights are off and there's nobody applauding, you should ask yourself something. In all these years of reflection and interviews, have you ever really thought about those poes and their families? Not as footnotes in your redemption arc, but as people who suffered while you posed for photos that broke their hearts." The words hit like a hammer. Fonda blinked hard, her lips trembling. For a moment, she looked as if she might speak, but no sound came. The studio was silent, except for the faint buzz of the air system, because that's what this was always about. Cruise continued softly, but unrelentingly. "It's not politics. It's empathy. It's about understanding that your choices had consequences far beyond yourself. And until you can face that honestly, no amount of activism or charity will ever undo it." He leaned back, letting the silence expand until it felt unbearable. "So before you judge anyone else's integrity or moral compass, maybe take a long look at your own. Figure out whether you've been trying to help people, or just trying to convince yourself that you're not the villain of your own story." Nobody moved. Fonda sat perfectly still, hollow-eyed, her composure stripped away. The other hosts looked helpless, unsure whether to end the show or simply disappear. Finally, Whoopi managed to find her voice. "Well," she said with forced brightness, "this has certainly been an intense discussion. Thank you for being here, Tom." But Cruise wasn't quite finished. He turned to the camera, his gaze steady, the room hanging on every syllable. "The truth is," he said, "people can question my beliefs, my life, my decisions, but I can sleep at night knowing I've never betrayed my country. I've never handed comfort to those who wished it harm. And I've never spent my life dressing up regret as wisdom. And I think that's a pretty good place to start any conversation about integrity. He rose, shook Whoopi's hand politely, nodded to the rest of the panel, and walked off the set with quiet certainty. The soundstage was dead silent. Fonda remained motionless for several seconds before finally lifting her head. The proud, defiant actress who'd entered the studio was gone. In her place sat a woman undone, fragile, defeated, and visibly shaken, and so ended one of the most brutal confrontations ever broadcast on daytime television. Tom Cruise hadn't merely defended himself, he had dismantled Jane Fonda's narrative, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for her to hide behind. Make sure to subscribe for more incredible celebrity moments like this.